The sanctuary smelled like wood polish and her sister's perfume. From where she stood in the doorway, breath still catching in her throat from climbing the church steps, Sienna watched it happen in slow motion. Emma glided down the centre aisle in her pale blue dress, the one that made her look angelic in soft lighting, her hair catching the stained glass colours as she moved. The congregation was still settling into their pews, hymnals rustling, quiet conversations floating up toward the vaulted ceiling. And there was Daniel. He sat 3 rows from the front on the left side, the same spot he'd chosen every Sunday for the past 6 months. The same spot where Sienna had first worked up the courage to sit beside him, where their hands had first touched over a shared hymnal, where he'd whispered compliments about her voice during worship songs. Emma didn't hesitate. She slipped into the pew beside him with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no, never being the second choice, never wondering if she was wanted. She angled her body toward him immediately, leaning close to whisper something that made him smile. That smile, the one Sienna had thought belonged to their private moments, to the coffee dates after service, to the late-night phone calls where he'd said he was falling for her. Sienna's feet had carried her forward without permission, but now they stopped. She stood in the aisle, holding her Bible against her chest like a shield, and watched Daniel laugh at something Emma said. Watched him shift in his seat to face her better. Watched him not look up, not scan the room, not search for Sienna the way he used to. The organ began its prelude. People were still moving, still finding seats. Sienna could walk down there. She could slide into that pew, reclaim the space that had always been hers. But her body knew something her mind was still refusing to accept. That space wasn't hers anymore. Maybe it never had been. She turned and walked to the back row instead, sinking into the worn wooden pew in the corner where the elderly widows usually sat. Mrs. Patterson gave her a curious look but said nothing, just patted her hand with fingers that felt like paper. The service passed in fragments. The pastor's voice rose and fell like waves against a shore she couldn't reach. The congregation stood to sing, sat to pray, stood again. Through it all, Sienna's eyes stayed fixed on the back of Emma's blonde head, on the way she tilted toward Daniel, on the way he didn't pull away. During the passing of the peace, when everyone turned to greet their neighbours, Sienna watched Daniel and Emma embrace. Not a side hug, not the brief Christian handshake everyone else exchanged. A real hug, his arms fully around her, her face pressed against his shoulder. It lasted 3 seconds too long. Long enough for Sienna's breath to stop. Long enough for the woman beside her to say, "Peace be with you," twice before Sienna heard it. After the final, hymn. After the benediction, Sienna didn't move. She let the congregation file out around her, a river of pressed clothes and Sunday shoes flowing past, while she sat like a stone in the current. She watched Daniel and Emma walk out together, his hand hovering at the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd. Her parents swept past without stopping, following Emma as they always did, drawn to her light like moths, who'd forgotten they had another daughter sitting in the shadows. The sanctuary emptied. The silence that replaced the organ music felt thick enough to drown in. Sienna sat there until the janitor started turning off lights in the side rooms, until the parking lot outside went quiet, until the sun shifted and the stained glass threw different coloured shadows across the floor. She thought about all the signs she'd ignored. The way Daniel had started taking longer to respond to her texts 3 weeks ago. The way he'd cancelled their last 2 coffee dates, claiming family obligations and work stress. The way Emma had suddenly developed an interest in attending the young adult service, instead of the contemporary one she usually preferred. The way her parents had smiled when Emma mentioned she might start coming to this service regularly. The way her mother had said, "It would be good for you to spend more time with Daniel, Emma. He's such a nice young man." As if Sienna hadn't been the one introducing him to her family. as if Sienna hadn't been the one holding his hand at their dining room table during Sunday dinners. The truth settled over her like dust. They'd all chosen, and none of them had chosen her. She stood finally, legs stiff from sitting too long. The church felt different in the quiet, larger, colder, empty in a way that matched the hollow space spreading through her chest. She drove home on autopilot, her mind far away, replaying every moment she'd missed, every warning she'd been too hopeful to heed. The house was empty when she arrived. Her parents and Emma had probably gone out to lunch with Daniel, the Sunday tradition Sienna had foolishly believed was about family time rather than showcasing Emma to the world. Sienna climbed the stairs to her room and sat on the edge of her bed, still in her church dress, staring at the wall where she'd hung a photo of her and Daniel from the church picnic 2 months ago. They looked happy. She looked happy, but happiness, she was learning, was just another thing that could be taken by someone who smiled brighter. The afternoon faded into evening. She heard her family come home, heard Emma's laugh floating up the stairs, heard her father's deep voice saying something approving. No one came to check on her. She lay back on her bed, still fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. The exhaustion that crept over her felt like more than missed sleep. It felt like the weight of every time she'd been overlooked, every moment she'd come second, every choice that had pushed her further into invisibility. Her chest ached, her throat burned with unshed tears. But she was too tired to cry, too empty to feel anything but a vast, spreading numbness. At some point, she stopped hearing the sounds from downstairs, stopped noticing the way the moonlight moved across her floor. Her heartbeat felt distant, a drum played in another room. She thought about tomorrow, about facing Daniel's apologetic eyes, about watching Emma wear her happiness like a crown, about her parents' confused expressions when she finally found the words to explain that she was breaking, about the weeks and months that would follow, watching their relationship bloom while she withered in the periphery. The thought of it exhausted her more than anything had ever exhausted her before. Her eyelids grew heavy, her breath slowed, the ache in her chest deepened and then, strangely, began to soften, like pain dissolving into distance, like drowning felt after you stopped fighting. The last thing she registered was a curious detachment from her own body, as if she were floating just above herself, watching a girl who tried so hard to be enough for people who'd never needed her to be anything at all. Then even that faded, and there was only quiet. Brightness pressed against her eyelids, warm and insistent. Sienna opened her eyes to sunlight streaming through a window, the angle all wrong, the quality of light too sharp and clear. She blinked, disoriented, her body feeling strange, lighter somehow, but also more present, more real than it had in those final fading moments. She sat up and the room tilted slightly before settling. Her room, but different. The photo of her and Daniel wasn't on the wall. Her bookshelf looked less crowded. The calendar hanging by her desk showed a date from 8 months ago. Her heart kicked against her ribs. She swung her legs out of bed and caught sight of herself in the mirror across the room. Younger. Her face was smoother, less marked by the stress lines that had started forming around her eyes in recent weeks. Her hair was longer. She'd cut it short 4 months ago, right after Daniel had mentioned he preferred longer hair on women. The phone on her nightstand showed the same impossible date. 8 months ago, before Daniel had started attending their church, before Emma had noticed him, before everything had fallen apart. Sienna's hands started shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs, forcing herself to breathe. She remembered dying, remembered the fade into nothing, the surrender to exhaustion that had felt like the only escape. But she also remembered everything that had come before. Every conversation, every betrayal, every moment of choosing to ignore her own shrinking boundaries because she'd wanted so desperately to be loved. She remembered it all. The certainty of it crystallized in her chest. This wasn't a dream. This was a second chance. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the familiar street, the same houses, the same trees. But she wasn't the same. The girl who'd sat in the back pew and accepted her own erasure was gone. The woman standing here, remembering her own ending, knew exactly what she'd lost by giving herself away in pieces to people who'd never valued them. Her phone buzzed, a text from Emma. "Mum wants to know if you're coming to breakfast. We're leaving in 20. Sienna stared at the message. In her first life, she'd rushed to get ready, had gone to the breakfast at the cafe downtown, where Emma had spent an hour talking about her new promotion, while their parents beamed with pride. Sienna had paid for everyone's meals and driven home alone. She typed back, "Going for a run. Enjoy." She changed into workout clothes, laced up her running shoes, and left the house before anyone could protest. The morning air felt crisp and new against her skin. She ran without a destination, letting her body remember what it felt like to move for herself, to choose her own direction. When she returned home an hour later, sweating and clear-headed, the house was still empty. She showered, changed, and spent the rest of the Sunday reading on the back porch with coffee, ignoring the texts that trickled in, asking where she was and why she'd missed family time. That evening, when her mother asked with faint disapproval why she'd skipped breakfast, Sienna simply said, "I needed space." Her mother blinked, confused, as if she'd never considered that Sienna might need anything at all. The weeks that followed felt like walking through a script she'd already memorized, except now she was changing all her lines. She knew the moments that were coming, the small tests that would establish new patterns. When her mother asked her to give up her Saturday to help Emma move apartments, Sienna said, "I have plans, maybe next weekend." She didn't have plans. She spent the day at a bookstore and then a movie alone, luxuriating in her own company. When her father suggested she could give Emma her concert tickets since Emma loves that band more, Sienna said, "I bought them for myself. I'm going." She went, stood in the crowd, sang until her voice was hoarse, and felt alive in a way she'd forgotten was possible. Small rebellions, tiny moments of choosing herself. Each one felt like learning to breathe in a new way. Her family noticed. They'd grown so accustomed to her yielding that her refusals felt like disruptions to the natural order. But Sienna held firm, polite but immovable, and slowly they began to adjust. Or at least they stopped expecting automatic surrender. Then came the Sunday morning she'd been quietly preparing for. Sienna woke early, spent time choosing her outfit with care, not to attract attention, but to feel confident in her own skin. A simple navy dress, elegant and understated. She wore her hair down because she liked it that way, not because anyone else had expressed a preference. She arrived at church, alone, having told her family she'd meet them there. The sanctuary was already half full when she walked in. She scanned the room with the calm knowledge of someone who knew exactly what was about to unfold. There, 3 rows from the front on the left, sat Daniel. He was new enough that people were still introducing themselves, still making space for him in the community. In her first life, she'd seen him from across the room and felt an immediate pull. Something about the way he looked a little lost, a little uncertain, had called to her nurturing instincts. She'd rushed over that day, eager to make him feel welcome, eager to be the one who helped him belong. She watched Emma enter through the side door, radiant as always, and saw the exact moment Emma's eyes landed on Daniel. Saw the calculation flicker across her sister's face. Attractive, well-dressed, alone, new. Perfect. Emma started moving toward him. Sienna turned and walked to the back of the sanctuary, to the last row in the corner. She sat down, arranged her Bible and notebook on the pew beside her, and settled into the worn wooden seat with a sense of rightness she hadn't expected. From here, she watched Emma slide into the pew beside Daniel, watched her sister turn on the charm, the bright smile, the engaging conversation, watched Daniel respond with polite interest, the way anyone would to a friendly stranger in an unfamiliar place. The service began. Sienna sang the hymns with a voice that felt stronger than before, unrestrained by the self-consciousness that had always made her hold back. She listened to the sermon with actual attention, absorbing words about finding peace in truth, about the strength that comes from knowing yourself. During the passing of the peace, she greeted Mrs. Patterson beside her, embraced the older woman with genuine warmth, and felt something loosen in her chest, the beginning of understanding that community didn't have to mean centering yourself around someone else's light. After the final hymn, she didn't rush out. She stayed in her pew, watching the congregation mingle. Emma and Daniel were talking near the front, but she could see the difference now. Emma was performing, working to hold his attention. Daniel was responding, but without the ease that would come from real connection. He looked, if anything, slightly overwhelmed. Sienna stood and made her way toward the side exit, the one that led to the courtyard where coffee and donuts were served after service. She'd avoided this space in her first life, too intimidated by the casual socializing, too convinced no one wanted to talk to her. Now she walked into the crowd with her head up. She accepted coffee from volunteer. She struck up a conversation with a woman from the prayer group. She laughed at someone's joke about the church, AC always being unpredictable. And after about 20 minutes, she felt someone's presence beside her. "I don't think we've met," a male voice said. "I'm Daniel. I just started coming here a few weeks ago." Sienna turned. He stood there with an uncertain smile, coffee cup in hand, looking genuinely interested in making a connection. But there was something in his eyes, a recognition maybe, or curiosity, as if he'd noticed her in the service, in the back row where she'd sat alone, and wondered about the woman who seemed content in her own space. "Sienna," she said, shaking his hand. "Welcome." "That's a beautiful name." He paused. "I noticed you were sitting in the back. Do you always sit there?" In her first life, she would have blushed, would have made excuses, would have immediately worked to make him comfortable with whatever answer he wanted. Now, she just smiled. "I do now. I like the perspective. I sat near the front today, but honestly, it felt a little exposed. I might try the back next time." She could see Emma watching from across the courtyard, her expression faltering as she realized Daniel had drifted away from her orbit. Sienna felt no triumph, no smugness, just a quiet observation of the moment unfolding differently than before. "It's a good spot," Sienna said. "Quieter. You can actually think during the service instead of feeling like you're on display." Daniel laughed. "Exactly. I've been to a few churches since moving here, and I'm still figuring out where I fit. Everyone's so eager to welcome me that it's almost overwhelming. People mean well, but sometimes it's nice to just exist without being anyone's project." Something shifted in his expression, a deepening interest, a recognition of truth. "You really get it." They talked for another 15 minutes, an easy conversation about finding peace in new places, about the challenge of being yourself in spaces that wanted to shape you into something familiar. When Sienna finally excused herself, because she had lunch plans with a college friend, something she deliberately scheduled this time, Daniel looked genuinely disappointed to see her go. "Maybe I'll see you next Sunday?" he asked, "in the back row." "Maybe," she said, non-committal but warm. She walked away, feeling lighter than air. The Sundays that followed established a pattern. Daniel did move to the back row. He sat alone at first, and Sienna would arrive and sit a few pews away, offering a friendly nod, but maintaining space. They'd talk after service sometimes. Casual conversations that never pressed for more, that let connection build naturally instead of through forced proximity. Emma tried twice more to capture his attention, but without Sienna's previous enthusiasm pushing Daniel into Emma's orbit, without the family dinners and group outings that had thrown them together, the connection never sparked. Emma eventually moved on to other pursuits, other potential romances, with the easy resilience of someone who'd never lacked options. Sienna's parents barely noticed. They were used to Emma's various romantic interests and had stopped tracking Sienna's social life years ago. But Sienna noticed everything. She watched herself build a life that was hers, taking the professional development course she'd always wanted, joining a hiking group, saying no to family obligations when they interfered with her own plans. She watched herself stop shrinking, stop apologizing, stop living in the margins of other people's stories. And she watched Daniel watch her. It was different this time. The attraction built slowly, rooted in respect rather than rescue. He sought her out after services, started texting her articles he thought she'd enjoy, asked her opinion on things like it mattered. There was no performance in it, no sense that she was competing for his attention. 3 months after that first meeting, he asked her to coffee after church. She said yes. 6 months in, he held her hand during the final hymn, standing beside her in the back row they'd claimed as their own space. The gesture felt earned, chosen, right. 8 months after Rebirth, after service on a bright Sunday morning, Daniel walked with her to the courtyard as usual. But instead of their normal, casual conversation, he stopped, turning to face her fully. "Can I ask you something?" His voice carried a nervous edge she'd learned meant he was being genuine. "Of course." "Why the back row? You never really explained. You have this amazing voice. I hear you during the hymns. You clearly know people here, but you always choose the back corner." Sienna looked past him toward the sanctuary, toward the pew 3 rows from the front, where Emma sometimes still sat, surrounded by admirers as she always was. "I used to sit up front," she said slowly. "I used to think I needed to be seen to matter. That if I wasn't right there in the middle of everything, I was invisible." She met his eyes again. "But I learned something important. The back row isn't about hiding. It's about choosing a place where I can see everything clearly, including myself." Daniel was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then he smiled, something tender and understanding in his expression. "I'm glad you were there, in the back row. I'm glad I found you there instead of..." He didn't finish, but she knew what he meant. Instead of in the crowd, instead of performing, instead of trying to be something for everyone else. "Me too," she said simply. That afternoon, her family gathered for their usual Sunday dinner. Emma chattered about her latest work achievement. Her parents listened with rapt attention. Sienna sat at the table, present but no longer waiting for scraps of notice. When the conversation lulled, and her mother asked, almost as an afterthought, "And how are you, Sienna?" She answered briefly and moved on. After dinner, as she was leaving, her father stopped her at the door. "You seem different lately," he said, searching her face as if seeing her for the first time in years. "More yourself, I suppose." Sienna smiled. "I am." He nodded slowly, something like regret flickering in his eyes before he turned back into the house. Weeks turned into months. Sienna and Daniel's relationship deepened with the kind of steady certainty that came from being chosen every day, not claimed once and forgotten. They moved through their courtship with intentionality, real conversations, shared values, mutual respect. 1 year after Rebirth, on a Sunday morning in the back row, Daniel leaned over during the opening hymn and whispered, "I love you." Sienna turned to him. This man who'd found her, not by chance, but by a second chance. in the exact place she'd chosen for herself. "I love you too," she whispered back. From 3 rows ahead, Emma glanced back during the song, her eyes landing on them. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Not quite envy, not quite regret. Recognition, maybe, that some story had unfolded differently than expected, and she'd played a role she didn't get to keep. She turned back around. The moment passed. After service, as the congregation filed out, Sienna noticed her mother watching her and Daniel leave together, his hand in hers. There was surprise in her mother's expression, and something else, a dawning awareness that she'd missed chapters of a story happening right beside her. Sienna felt no anger toward her family anymore, no burning need for them to understand what they'd done. Their blindness had been its own punishment, causing them to overlook something that was now thriving beyond their notice. They would live with their patterns, their favourites, their comfortable dynamics, and she would live free of the need for their validation. 2 years after Rebirth, Daniel proposed, not in front of a crowd, not as a performance, but on a quiet hiking trail they'd come to love, with no one around but the trees and sky to witness. The ring was simple and perfect, chosen because he knew her, not because he was trying to impress anyone else. She said yes with the calm certainty of someone who'd already died once and learned exactly what mattered. The wedding was small, intimate friends, a few family members, held in the church where they'd met, but not in the sanctuary. They chose the garden courtyard, the one where they'd first really talked, where their story had begun with honest conversation instead of manufactured proximity. Emma served as a bridesmaid because Sienna asked her to, not out of obligation, but out of a generous peace that came from no longer needing anything from her sister. Emma stood beside her in a pale green dress, beautiful as always, and Sienna felt nothing but calm. When the ceremony ended and Sienna walked back down the makeshift aisle with Daniel, she caught sight of her parents in the audience. Her mother was crying, but there was something in her expression beyond happy tears. There was loss there, a late realization of something she'd let slip through her fingers without noticing until it was beyond her reach. Her father sat rigid, watching with an expression Sienna had never seen before. It took her a moment to recognize it. Regret, sharp and uncomfortable, the kind that comes from understanding you've been blind when you should have seen. Sienna met their eyes briefly, offered a small smile and walked past. There was no anger in her heart, no satisfaction in their discomfort. Just a quiet truth. They would live with what they'd chosen, just as she would live with what she'd reclaimed. At the reception, as Sienna and Daniel shared their first dance, she saw Emma standing at the edge of the floor, watching. Her sister's expression was complicated, not exactly sad, but not happy either. Something hollow had crept into Emma's eyes over the past 2 years, a gradual realization that being everyone's first choice had made her no one's lasting choice. The parade of brief romances, the string of promising starts that fizzled, the growing awareness that charm without depth was a diminishing currency. Emma would be fine. She'd always be fine in the ways that showed from the outside. But Sienna understood now that there were deeper ways to be fine, richer ways to be chosen, and those had always been beyond her sister's reach because Emma had never learned that being seen wasn't the same as being known. The music swelled. Daniel pulled Sienna closer, whispering something that made her laugh. The moment felt perfect, not because it was flawless, but because it was real, built on truth, earned through patience, chosen with full awareness. Years passed. Sienna's career flourished in ways it never had before, because she stopped accepting opportunities that diminished her and started pursuing ones that challenged her to grow. She built friendships that fed her soul instead of draining it. She created a home with Daniel that felt like sanctuary. They still attended the same church. They still sat in the back row. But now, their young daughter sat between them, learning the same hymns her mother sang with that strong, unrestrained voice. Sometimes, Sienna would see new people come in, uncertain and seeking, and watch them gravitate toward the front rows where everything felt alive and immediate. She'd smile, remembering, understanding that some lessons had to be learned through living them, through choosing wrong before learning to choose right. Emma attended church less frequently now. When she did come, she sat alone near the middle, scrolling through her phone during the pastor's sermon, leaving immediately after the final hymn. The light that used to draw everyone had dimmed somehow, or perhaps it had always been more reflection than source. Their parents still doted on her, still called her their pride and joy. But increasingly, there was a brittle quality to it, an insistence that everything was wonderful, even as the evidence suggested otherwise. At a family Christmas dinner, 3 years after the wedding, Emma announced yet another breakup, with strained cheerfulness. Sienna's mother immediately began comforting her, already strategizing about who Emma should meet next. Her father nodded along, offering assurances that Emma was too good for anyone who couldn't see her value. Across the table, Sienna felt Daniel's hand find hers under the table, a quiet anchor. She squeezed back. Later, as they were leaving, Emma caught Sienna alone in the hallway. "Can I ask you something?" Emma's voice was soft, stripped of its usual performance. "How did you know? With Daniel? How did you know it would last?" Sienna looked at her sister, really looked at her, and saw someone who'd gotten everything she'd ever wanted and discovered it wasn't enough. "I didn't know," Sienna said honestly, "but I knew myself. And I knew I'd rather be alone than be with someone who made me smaller." Emma's eyes glistened. "I don't think anyone's ever made me feel bigger. I think I've always been the one making myself bigger and everyone else smaller." It was the truest thing Emma had ever said to her. "It's not too late," Sienna said gently, "to learn who you are when you're not performing." Emma nodded, but they both knew some lessons came too late to change the trajectory entirely. Patterns too deeply worn, relationships too damaged, opportunities too far past. Sienna hugged her sister, not out of obligation, but out of genuine compassion for someone who'd won every battle and lost the war. As she and Daniel drove home that night, their daughter asleep in the back seat, Sienna thought about her first life, about the girl who'd sat in the back pew and accepted invisibility as her lot, about the death that had felt like the only escape from a life lived in service of others' stories. She thought about the gift she'd been given, the chance to rewrite not just events, but her own understanding of her worth. The church parking lot was empty when they passed it, the building dark except for the eternal light that always burned in the sanctuary. But in her mind's eye, she could see the back row, could feel the worn wooden pew beneath her, could hear the hymns sung with full voice. She could see herself there, alone but not lonely, present but not performing, seen by the only person who'd mattered all along, herself. And in that quiet space she'd chosen, she'd found everything she'd been looking for. Peace, earned through surrender of the wrong things. Love, built on the foundation of self-knowledge. Freedom, carved from the courage to sit alone rather than shrink in company. The car turned down their street. Home waited, warm with light. Daniel's hand rested on her knee, comfortable and certain. In the rearview mirror, her daughter slept with the peaceful trust of a child who'd never known what it was to be overlooked. Sienna smiled into the darkness, her reflection in the window showing a woman who died once and learned how to truly live. The protagonist had won, not through revenge, but through reclamation. The antagonists would live with their choices, their favoritisms, their blindness. They would wake every day to the consequences of what they'd dismissed, carrying the weight of what they'd let slip away. But Sienna would wake to Daniel's smile, to her daughter's laughter, to work that fulfilled her, to a life built on the bedrock of her own worth. She'd taken the seat in the back row, and from there she'd found everything.